Summer routines live or die by how easy they are, and honestly, if something takes too much effort, I'm out. That's why Groons is my go-to. It's my one daily pack of gummies covering my greens, vitamins, and minerals. Plus, it has 6 grams of prebiotic fiber, which is more than 2 cups of broccoli. No mixing powders, no giant pills, no hassle. I just rip open the pack and I'm done. They taste good and they make it easy to stay on top of my health, even when life gets busy. Save up to 52% with the code PODCAST at Groons.co. That's code PODCAST at GRUNS.co.
Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 164, recording on Thursday, May 7th. Guest for you today is Robert Mays. He is the host of The Athletic Football Show, one of the premier podcasts in the NFL space. Always enjoy having him on. He might have been our first ever guest like 2 years ago doing this podcast. So we talked about the GM search, asked him a little bit about his Kyler Murray thoughts. I think at the top it was a lot of Caleb Banks and that draft pick and what he thought about that. But a really fun conversation as always with Robert, and I appreciate him taking time out of his morning to help us out and have a fun little convo. If you're new here and watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. Helps us out a ton. We've loved building this show 2 times a week, every single week. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or iHeart, I appreciate it. We appreciate you. You can follow us over there, rate, review, give us some stars, whatever you feel like on the little page. Not gonna complain about any of it. So thanks for that. This show is presented by First Resource Bank. If you don't know about it, they're a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area, run by really good people. Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson. They are Vikings fans. They are curious as anyone about the GM search, and their banking platform doesn't leave a lot to curiosity. You know what you're going to get. You got, easy to log in online and do whatever you would like with, moving money around on their website, which is in the description. They've got branches all over the place. So really, really great people, care about the community. Cannot thank them enough for their support. The show is also sponsored by Pro Amen Athletics. I saw the other day that they are getting ready for their 7-on-7 league this summer. So you guys, hopefully by now you kind of know, Pro Amen is, I would say it's one of the premier hubs for youth football development in Minnesota. It was started by 3 guys who really just wanted their kids and friends' kids who they know to have the premier opportunity for development. And if your son or friend's kids sign up as part of this and they want to improve as a quarterback or as a receiver or offensive lineman, what have you, they'll get to work with former college players who know what it's like to improve and enter the high school level, ready to show up and compete. So been awesome to collab with those guys. I really love what they're trying to do within the space for the sport that we all love here in Minnesota. So Pro Amen, their information is in the description. We'll start off the top with a little bit of information on the Vikings GM search, and it's been something that I wrote pretty in depth about on Wednesday. On Wednesday, actually, the Vikings submitted a bunch of interview requests with assistant GMs across the league. Those names are as follows. It's Terrence Gray, the assistant GM for the Buffalo Bills. It's John McKay, the assistant GM for the Los Angeles Rams. Dave Ziegler, assistant GM for the Titans. RJ Gillen, the assistant GM for the 49ers. Nolan Teasley, the assistant GM for the Seahawks. And Chad Alexander, the AGM for the Los Angeles Chargers. All of these guys have a personnel background, which stands out immediately when you look at the list. When you dive a little deeper and just try to discern who a lot of these guys are individually, you hear a lot of different things. And I'll just talk a little bit one by one. Terrence Gray was a longtime college scout for the Vikings, worked under the staff Rick Spielman. It's going to have a lot of crossover in the interview process in terms of understanding this organization, how they operate, and he will have relationships internally that definitely, I would imagine, are to his benefit throughout the process. So that's what I'd say about Terrence. I've talked to a couple people across the league, not in the Vikings building, who speak really highly of just the evaluation chops, who also praised him for just, the way he kind of goes about it and works with people. So that's Terrence Gray. Dave Ziegler was the former GM, actually, of the Las Vegas Raiders in 2022 and 2023, working in tandem with Josh McDaniels, who was a one-time mentor of Kevin O'Connell. But Ziegler is probably the most, like, GM-centric person on the list in terms of someone who has worked within that traditional structure of just a GM with a pretty dominant say, I would say, within the structure, as opposed to maybe someone in a more personnel background who has, as a lot of these other guys on this list, where they are probably more malleable. And if the Vikings were to go a route of, let's say, keeping Rob Brzezinski in a elevated role of working with coaching staff, like Ziegler would probably be more of the traditional GM type. One of the I would say probably the only one on this list. RJ Gillen, young guy in San Francisco, has worked on the pro scouting side there for years now, and it has a lot of respect from agents and folks within the league. So he hasn't gotten a ton of interviews, I don't think, in years past. Potentially was a part of the Falcons process, but definitely understand him being part of this search. John McKay, younger guy who was exposed to Kevin O'Connell, obviously, in Kevin's time in Los Angeles. The Rams are one of the most revered spots just in terms of how they operate, the synergy and alignment with which they operate. So John McKay is also more of the pro scouting side. That's more of where he comes from. Same with Nolan Teasley from Seattle, has been one of John Schneider's right-hand men. I'd say it's been him, a guy, Matt Berry, Trent Kirshner over there. But Teasley, I'm not sure it's going to be the most like dominant personality, but in the event that the Vikings do go with the structure of Rob Brzezinski and the coaching staff, you probably don't need the most dominant personality, and Teasley's experience would fit in on the pro scouting side. And then Chad Alexander, interesting background where he's an Ozzie Newsome guy, grew up in the Baltimore Ravens organization, kind of rose the ranks there, transitioned to the New York Jets, working with Joe Douglas, and that probably comes with a connotation. But a lot of the people I've talked to, scouts, agents, they do think highly of Chad and just the expertise. And then um, he's been with the Los Angeles Chargers, working with Joe Ortiz, their new GM there, and sounds like he'd be opinionated on players, but has a lot of ties within the college space that would be a benefit. So it'll be interesting to see how this thing progresses. Rob Brzezinski is obviously a candidate as well. I expect the process to begin with some Zoom interviews. I expect Andrew Miller, the Vikings COO, to be a part of that process. Who on the coaching side has a say or an opinion or a sway, and when that say or opinion comes within the process is something that I'm curious about. But I'll obviously be following it pretty closely over the course of the next weeks to see how this thing progresses, and going to be fascinated to hear, I would say, just what elements of these candidates drive them to being finalists as part of the process. So the search firm is obviously playing a big role. That's Turnkey ZRG. The two guys in charge there, Chad Shatlos and Sean McGee. Chad is really well known in the college football space. Was a part of the hiring of Kurt Signetti with Indiana, Steve Sarkisian with Texas, Brett Yomark of the commissioner of the Big 12. Like Chad has participated with a lot of those, and then Sean McGee was the Bears chief of staff. Then he was the Michigan GM, and they were both these guys are Naval Academy grads who have kind of joined together to spearhead some of this search. So yeah, again, any questions you guys have on it, I'd say toss them in the comments section. Throw them at us on social media at Alec_Lewis, at Alec Lewis Show, and I'll try to use some of those questions, both answer them on social media, but also answer them in future podcasts, because I think it's important. And this, I mean, you talk to anybody, like, it's a pretty critical hire here, regardless of what the structure ends up being. So with that, I'll be back for another episode this week after rookie minicamp Friday afternoon. Looking forward to that. Let's not waste any more time. Here's Robert Mays of the Athletic Football Show talking GM, Kyler, Caleb Banks, and much more. All right, Robert, welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. How are you?
I'm doing well. You know, we're in the off season, sort of, you know, post draft. And so it's always an interesting time in the NFL calendar for a lot of us trying to figure out what we want to talk about, how we want to handle it. And so yeah, it's good. It's good to be to May. I enjoy this stretch of time very much.
Do you try to view this period as like it allows you to talk about bigger things, or is it, you know, I'm just curious, how do you view it for the podcast?
Yeah, I think it, you know, we do a lot of stuff at this time of year. We're doing a series of shows about every offseason in the NFL, like whether you're, you know, essentially buying or selling, how teams approached it. We do a series of shows in June that we really allow us to look back, and, you know, we call it the lingering questions, which, you know, we do probably 4 or 5 of them a year. And there are just so many things during the end of last season where you didn't have time to be paying attention to it, right? You're watching all the playoff teams. And so was I watching Jackson Dart with bated breath in week 17 last year? Probably not, right? And so you want to go back and kind of check in about what teams were doing, what they, you know, some of the younger players, overall like trajectories and stuff. And so I just think it gives you time to talk to people, to try out different things, to think about things a little bit differently. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely how we think about this stretch of the calendar for sure.
So are you buying or selling the Vikings offseason?
I was buying it. I apparently Vikings fans are very pessimistic and very down on everything they've done. I'm like, I don't know, man. Kyler Murray is like a pretty good consolation prize if you're paying a quarterback $1 million. And I appreciate the fact that when you don't have a general manager and the buck doesn't have to stop anywhere, if you swing and miss in the draft, just swinging as hard as possible. Like, I appreciate that as a mindset overall. Like, it's part of the reason, and again, I don't know, who knows if this actually works out with the Caleb Banks stuff and all that, but I think part of the reason that some teams in the NFL are risk averse when it comes to the decisions they make on prospects is, well, what if it doesn't work out? You know, like, the downside of this is so real. Like, well, let's play that out. If Caleb Banks doesn't work out for the Vikings, is that going to be on Kevin O'Connell's ledger? I don't think so. Right. And so the idea that no one is really going to be responsible for this at the end of the day, I actually think allows you to do some things from a player acquisition standpoint that you might not in a more traditional setting. And I think that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's fascinating because, I mean, my first inclination talking through that is like, well, the buck stops with Brian Flores, but like the success that Brian Flores has had over the last 3 years, like you could probably avoid a bit of a chip on the ledger. I mean, or you could probably absorb that. You're going to be totally okay because of the influence that he's had on this defense. And I mean, it is interesting to go through that conversation, because I do think so often, and you could probably speak to this even much more than I can, it's like you have these decision makers, you know, making decisions based upon their own job security or what have you, as opposed to just, you know, thinking big like that specific swing. So it's a fun one to talk through, but I think to your point, the reaction has been drastic from those here locally, no question about it.
If Brian Flores gets fired by the Vikings, the Caleb Banks pick is like 10 notches down the list of why he was fired by the Vikings. Like, I just don't think it's going to have anything to do with whether Caleb Banks works out or not. And so I think that's partially why it's worth doing. Like, I don't know, man. Like, in the first round, I think you should try to find superstars. Like, if you miss out on a guy because maybe there's a little bit of risk involved, maybe there's a lot of risk involved, I tend to be okay with that line of thinking. And I think for their defensive front specifically, in a world where you trade Jonathan Grenard, you see what happens with Van Ginkel, who's a lot older than you want him to be. I think the Gold-A thing probably speaks to that a little bit. But you're going to be in a place potentially on May 7th, 2026, where who are your difference makers along the defensive line? Again, the answer to that is going to depend on how you feel about Dallas Turner, but I think trying to do everything you can to find a guy that you think can be one of those gravitational players and has the talent to do that, I'm okay with it. I can say that because I don't lose my job if it doesn't work out. But in this rare situation, I think all the people associated with the Minnesota Vikings can also say that.
Well, that's part of the way I've described a lot of these picks is like, you really have confidence in this situation as opposed to many others that there is that you're going to have continuity with system. I mean, again, Brian Flores' name will probably surface in head coaching jobs, but the fact he hasn't gotten one to this point, I think speaks volumes to the potential candidacy. So if you draft guys who fit perfectly with your specific system and give them 2 to 3 years of runway to develop and evolve within that system, it totally makes sense. I want to circle back to this at the end, but I want to get, we'll go deep here on the GM situation because to me, and maybe I'm just ridiculous, like it's the most interesting facet of this team right now before we get to the summer and get to see these quarterbacks on the field. What is just, I mean, you've covered this league a long time. I'd say, what does this circumstance or this situation compare to in your mind in terms of waiting until after the draft to hire a GM? And or I guess, is there a comparison in your mind?
It's a great question. I'd have to think back. I'm sure it's happened. And I mean, because there are some teams that fire a GM after the draft. And I'd have to think back about a specific example, but that's absolutely happened before, where there are teams that, well, this front office went through the entire process during the season of scouting, of putting together the draft board, all of that. Like, if we're going to move on from this person, maybe we can just do it after the draft. It doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened since I started covering the league. And so this is not unprecedented where a team is waking up a week after round one ended without a general manager. That does happen. And I understand if you're a Vikings fan feeling a little bit of consternation about the fact that no one is in that role and you're excited to see who's going to be in that role. But at the same time, it's like, what are you rushing toward? Is there why do you need one right now? Like I just don't know if there needs to be a ton of urgency here. I think that the focus should be on finding the right person and figuring out what the right move forward is here for you as a franchise.
Yeah, I think that it's a very clear-minded way of thinking about it. I think the arguments to that probably, if you talk to people in the league, probably would be like, well, the further delayed would be the longer it takes to then implement change or establish new processes. But I think to your point, it's like, what is it? Are you targeting speed of change or are you targeting the correct change? Is probably the correct, and clear-minded way of looking at it. I wonder, part of the reason I want to have you is because I think these GM positions and what the GM role is within the NFL right now is interesting to me. And there have been many different structures. You've seen what the Falcons have put together. You've seen the way the Jaguars put their front office together, the way the Miami Dolphins ran their search with Troy Aikman. What do you think about what is necessary for a GM in the era of the NFL right now with where things are?
It's a great question. I think it needs to, I think that this is not like a novel thought. I think that it needs to go beyond just finding the super scout and that's what you're doing next. And I think that, the Vikings are such a unique case, right? Just because they went the exact opposite direction with the last hire that they made. I think that having somebody that is a good communicator, is a good manager of people, and can do a good job of setting the vision for how you want to build your roster and incorporating a lot of different ideas and voices into that to me is like the best place to land. And so I think it's somebody that is a very, very just has vision, right? And so like somebody that I actually respect the job they've done. I think this is a very good example because I think there are some guys where you look at like Howie Roseman and like the archetype of general manager that Howie Roseman is. And I think Howie does a very good job. And he kind of comes from a non-football place, you know? But I do think that you can be a modern general manager that does come from a more traditional football place and still be incorporating all the things that I'm talking about. Like, I actually have a lot of respect for the way that Dan Morgan has approached the job in Carolina. Like, if you look at the way that Carolina's front office is set up, Dan Morgan's the general manager. I mean, you might be too young for this, but like I watched Dan Morgan play football. Like, I remember Dan Morgan playing and being like a very scary linebacker. And so now you have this guy who has that sort of background, is a former player, but then Carolina's front office, like Brant Tillis, who's their number 2, and I think I don't know what his exact title is, whether it's assistant GM or some sort of like head of strategy, but Brant is like very analytically minded, analytically driven. He comes from Kansas City where he handled a lot of cap stuff for them. Eric Eager works on their like strategy kind of analytics side over there. Like they have a lot of that incorporated into their decision making. And so like I think that there's a way to be a football guy and incorporate very different thought processes into like how you're picking players and why you're doing that. And so I think having somebody that can be at the front of the room, can be a leader, can be somebody that is getting everybody on the same page, moving in the same direction, while also being a person who's very open to like modern ideas, doing everything you can to stay ahead. Like, I think that is the correct balance. And I think that finding that is not always easy, but I think that's what teams should be searching out and seeking for.
Yeah, I think it's really well laid out. In conversation with people around the league, like I think for me, the thing that people have asked, you throw out names and it's like, can that person galvanize a staff? And I don't really, it's a hard thing to try to probably identify in somebody, but it seems like that is something that should matter or does matter, like with scouting staffs of having a vision, having someone that everyone can buy into. I think what makes this specific job interesting, and I've talked through this and tried to think about it critically, is this coaching staff over the course of the last 3 years has generated and garnered a lot of sway in personnel decision making. And so the challenge that I feel in terms of whether it's ownership, the search firm, Andrew Miller, the COO, in trying to find this next person is, how can you find somebody who can enter the building that has enough respect and cachet that the coaching staff, believes in what their vision is, while also being able to kind of revamp where this organization has been and can go. And like that, to me, feels like a really fine needle to thread. I think it's possible, but it makes this specific one, in my opinion, and I'd be curious to get your opinion, just a little bit more interesting, or you have to be very fine with the type of person that you do bring in.
I think it's just the dynamics at play here are worth noting for that exact reason. You have certain situations around the NFL, and we know there are plenty of them that we know about, right? Like the situation with like San Francisco and John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan. Like Kyle Shanahan was hired, John Lynch was hired after Kyle Shanahan. We know kind of who's driving the car when it comes to the decisions that the 49ers make. And there are plenty of those examples, right? Like the Niners are in one of those spots. I think that you look at what's happening in Jacksonville, where Liam Cohen was already hired before they brought in James Gladstone. I think that Liam Cohen has had, even for a first-time head coach, an outsized kind of role in some of the personnel decisions that the Jags have made. I think that you can see that starting to shift a little bit in Chicago, where I think Ben Johnson has consolidated a decent amount of power. And so now you're in a spot where is the Vikings GM who's going to come in, are they that more like Kyle Shanahan sort of role, what George Payton is in Denver, where that the head coach is actually the one that has consolidated a lot of the power in that building? And what does that mean for the candidates that you can woo?
Yeah.
and what does that mean for how things actually operate? So I think that is absolutely worth noting. Like the moment that you keep the head coach but fire the GM and they're no longer on the same timeline anymore, the power dynamics in the building start to shift unless you are very overt in establishing what that dynamic looks like by bringing in somebody where it's just like, this is at the top. He has say in all of these matters. And I'm just not sure that's going to happen with the way that the Vikings are currently set up.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it does. It has come up for me of like, what if I've talked to agents who are like, if my client's interested in this job, what is the dynamic that they're walking into in terms of how much sway they're going to be able to have? So it does come up. It is pretty interesting. What do you think of the trend that you've seen in Atlanta, where it is Matt Ryan, Ian Cunningham? In Jacksonville, you have Tony Baselli, the former player James Gladstone, like it almost is like the three-pronged type of look where you have more of a younger guy and as part of it. Like, what do you think of that trend? Because I do think there is like a very stark difference of those types of structures, and then the Howie Roseman, centric GM, the John Snyder centric GM. Like, it does feel like there's kind of a divergence of, like, those are two very clear paths that you could go down, and they probably have strengths and weaknesses, both of them.
It's absolutely worth bringing up. And the other team I would throw out when it comes to how this has worked is the Lions hiring Chris Spielman as part of like the overall process before they hired Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. And so we've seen this work out several different times. And, Jacksonville, I think, is on its way to working out. The early returns are very good. I would have a hard time. I'm sure you've talked to more people about this than I have, but I would love to hear someone articulate what that person's role is supposed to be. Like, is that person just a go-between and because my understanding of like what Matt Ryan is that Matt Ryan is somebody who is deeply familiar with Arthur Blank as a person. He knows how to talk to Arthur Blank. There's a way to kind of, I think, streamline communication and be sort of a translator and go-between for the owner in a way that maybe insulates or kind of optimizes the way that you're like those sides of the building are talking to each other. I think Tony Baselli may be the same thing in Jacksonville. And I think that you can make an argument that that's what Chris Spielman was for Sheila Spanford when she got the job. And so I think that might be it, where it's like, this is somebody that is familiar with ownership, can be ownership's eyes and ears in a good way, can be like a sounding board for them. If that's all it is, I think that's fair. I'd be curious if after you talk to people, like what the thought process would be for that. Like, what is the stated utility of that former player in that role? Because I have a guess of what it is, but I don't know exactly how I would articulate it in a way where it's like working out correctly.
No, and I think that's part of what I find interesting about that structure is like, how clearly defined is that role, and are these roles within that structure? It's a who is reporting to who type of question, and then it is like the day-to-day, what does that look like? I think with Rob Brzezinski here with the Vikings, and a lot of this, I mean, if he were to be in that structure, it would be the eyes and ears of ownership, given he's worked with them now for 2 decades, and it would be the cap expertise and negotiating expertise above all, as well as an understanding of internally the levers that you need to pull given the personality. So I think that's why there are a lot of people, both internally and externally, who believe that Rob Brzezinski should, I'd say, occupy a major seat within it. That does then just lead you to the question of, then what is the new GM's primary responsibility and how much sway will they have? So I had a conversation with an agent last week, and the conversation was like, why is some of these structures the trend? Is this something that we will look back on and be like, that was the beginning of what it's going to look like in every building? I find it kind of interesting that the structures have differed in that way, for better or worse. So it's I don't know, probably worth just evaluating over time.
I also think it's just worth digging into more. Like, you're getting my gears turning now about like, doing more like an audit about what every team's front office structure looks like which ones have worked out, which ones haven't. Is there a right way to do this? Is there a wrong way to do this? Do the successful organizations, do they have a consistency about like which positions exist and what the purview of those positions is? I honestly like haven't spent as much time thinking about that as I probably could or should. And for somebody in your spot right now, like I think those are exactly the questions that you and Vikings fans should be asking, as it feels like so much about the structure moving forward is currently on the table.
Yeah, it actually reminds me a lot of my covering baseball. Like you had very different structures in baseball where sometimes it was, GM driven, and then there became the president of baseball ops structure who became really the figurehead for the organization. In football, obviously the head coach occupies the power. So it's fascinating to kind of, juxtapose those two things for me. How much, if at all, like over the time you've covered the league, have you tried to dive into these are guys coming up who are interesting names that I've got my eyes on? I'd wonder if there's anybody within the league, just based upon your conversations, where you're like, those names intrigue me as potential candidates for this job or other GM jobs.
If I'm just being totally honest with you, I have more relationships, touch points with people that are one or two rungs down on coaching staffs than I do with people who are one or two rungs down in front offices. Like if you ask me who the next group of head coaches should be, the next group of coordinators, I would have a lot more to say about that than I would about the front office people. It's honestly been something I've tried to be better about this offseason specifically, where it's like I got to a point where, and I think there's reasons for this, like, letting people behind the curtain like a tiny bit. Like when I travel for training camp or when I'm going to teams, you would understand this. It's very normal in the run of like a practice for you to talk to like the tight ends coach when he walks off the field. It's less normal for you to be like, can I talk to the assistant general manager after practice? Like it's just not something that is done as often. And I think you have to be a little bit more creative with like how you're seeking out those relationships and building those relationships. And I just haven't been nearly as good about that. And so the front office people specifically is just more of a blind spot when it comes to the up and coming candidates than like maybe coaching staffs would be.
It's also too, and like the hard part for me, people ask like, who's the best and the hard part is like, you're discerning the conversation we just had about the structure in every building. It's different in every building. So the responsibilities of vice president of player personnel in one building might differ completely from a person, say, in another building. So it is like, I do think it is interesting, and it does cloud the, perspective probably on like who is the next prime candidate. And so I will say this, like, I know this about the Viking search in that they've submitted a lot of their slips. Not a lot of them are out there because the search firm is trying to keep it very tight, which is smart and understandable. And it feels like they're going through a pretty methodical, strategic process to try to figure out like who would bring the most value, which you respect in many ways if that is kind of how it lands. To segue a little bit and go a little rapid fire, you mentioned Kyler Murray. We haven't really talked a ton since that happened. Like, what did you think of them being able to secure this guy? And what do you think him in this system will look like, can look like? How intriguing is it to you?
To me, it's crazy that this could be viewed as anything else than like the best possible scenario. Like if you do everything you can, the way the Vikings did, over a multi-year period to maneuver your way to draft a quarterback in the first round, and that quarterback strikes out as spectacularly as this has so far, winding up with Kyler Murray in his age 29 season for free it doesn't get better than this. And I'm not saying that Kyler Murray is like the seventh best quarterback in the league, but when you're in the situation that the Vikings are in and you're painted into that sort of corner, this is the best possible outcome for you, like almost without fail. And so I think this should be, if you're a Vikings fan and you're sitting there in week, trying to think of like a particularly bad JJ McCarthy game, if you're sitting there in like week 10 last year and you're like, man, like, what is the pathway out of the darkness that we now find ourselves in? Kyler Murray is like a pretty good torch to have found. Like, I think that's a pretty good spot to be. The way that it fits with the offense, I think there's absolutely going to be, a transition, an acclimation period. Like, we've seen Kyler Murray in and under center, like play action centric sort of offense, and it's not the place that he is most comfortable. And so what that looks like, I think there's still a little bit of guesswork involved, but I absolutely think that kind of the vertical elements of the Kevin O'Connell offense and just some of the other things that he's been able to do from his time in LA, where it was a little bit more spread out. Like, I think there's plenty of reason to believe that they will be able to figure out a way this should operate to get the most out of Kyler Murray in what is still a pretty good situation.
Yeah, it is funny, like, the perspective, and it's been cool for me. I remember when they made that signing official. I remember I think I sent you a text of like, what there's a lot of narratives around this guy, what have you, and it's been fun for me to talk to people who spent time around him, and this will lead to stories at some point down the road. But he's a really interesting figure, and I think his status like speaks to a lot of perceptions about quarterbacks, quarterback play, what a quarterback needs to be, what a quarterback needs, how they need to operate. So I just, as someone who loves that aspect of just like studying it, it's going to be fun to just follow over time. The last thing would just be, like, how do you view the NFC North with where things are right now? And I would say the Bears, which are near and dear to your heart, coming off the season that they're coming off of. The Packers in an interesting spot, obviously turning over defensive coordinator and some personnel. And then the Lions have a new offensive coordinator. They've made a bunch of additions. Like, this division feels like it is always in an interesting spot. But how do you view both the Vikings' place in it and where it is months before this thing gets going?
It's a beautiful mess. I have no idea. Like, all of these teams, I think, have like a baseline level of competence and a justifiable excitement around them. Like, I'm really curious to see what the Lions look like with Drew Petzing there. The Lions obviously still have a ton of talent. Like, the Lions, outside of, I mean, they've been very unlucky injury-wise for the last couple of years, but the Lions were absolutely like a playoff quality team last year, even as they fired their offensive coordinator halfway through the season. Like, that is still a very, very good roster with a lot of upside, and I think it could absolutely be a playoff team again in 2026. The Vikings, I'm still optimistic about where the Vikings are. Like, I still think that if the offensive line stays healthy, I just don't think I think our appreciation for the overall quality of the supporting cast and supporting pieces on the Vikings eroded a little bit last year because the offensive line was so banged up. I think we've forgotten like what sort of environment that is for the quarterback if the offensive line can stay healthy. And so I'm still very excited about overall like what the Vikings are and what the Vikings can be, especially which is even baseline level quarterback play, which I think they can get next year. And then the Packers are perpetually a team that, like, man, what could the Packers be if things break right? We'll see if they end up breaking right for the first time, but I still think that's a team with a lot of underlying talent on it. And the Bears did what the Bears did last year. Like, you could tell me, I think you could make a very serious argument for any of the four teams winning the division. Like, I think you could easily come in and make that argument. Maybe it's a little bit tougher for the Vikings right now than it is with some of the others, but I don't know why it would be that much tougher. Like, we saw them win 14 games 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I've said this many times, like in recent weeks, but if Caleb Banks is healthy and as dominant as he might possibly be, if Dallas Turner continues his progression, like, these are a lot of ifs. If Christian Darrisaw returns to the Christian Darrisaw that I think the fans watching and listening to this podcast became used to in recent years, and if Kyler Murray is maximized by a head coach who has maximized veteran quarterbacks in all of his time previous to this, like, it's understandable. So it's interesting. I don't know, the GM thing. I said this to you before we started recording. I'm interested by it, maybe too much so, but I think structure in this era of where the NFL is, and with head coaches that have powers, it's just it's fascinating to me. So thanks for talking through it a little bit. Sorry to probably dive so deep there. It's just it's fun.
Always happy to. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I'll be curious what you come away with as you do a little bit more digging on what some of these look like around the league and what seems to be working for people.
Yeah. Once they settle it, I'll go to Porzana and celebrate that I now have an off season to enjoy. That is, it should be a good time. Thanks for hopping on, Robert. Appreciate it. Always fun.
Of course, man.
And that'll do it for episode 164 of the Alec Lewis Show. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate Robert for taking the time. It was a blast to catch up as always. I will say, if you want more intel on the Vikings GM search, I'll probably talk through it a little bit Friday afternoon after rookie minicamp. We'll also have some observations of watching all of the rookies out there, so looking forward to that. But there's also a story at The Athletic that ran Wednesday morning where I try to get into everything. I mentioned a couple of the guys at the search firm Turnkey ZRG who are involved with this search and driving a lot of the process. And then just got into a lot of the dynamics with Rob Brzezinski, the coaching staff, et cetera. So highly recommend going to check out that story at theathletic.com. And we will have more in the coming weeks on this specific situation. Appreciate our presenting sponsor, First Resource Bank. Appreciate Pro Men Athletics, which has academies and 7-on-7 leagues throughout the summer to develop kids who love this game that we get to talk about multiple times a week. And then Unreal. I'm wearing their joggers right now, so don't have it up top. But like I say every time, Unreal, the clothing brand based here, I'm rocking on a daily basis. So it's awesome athleisure. Again, they've got partnerships with the NFL, the NHL. They have limited edition drops throughout the spring, summer, and fall. So their information is in the description below. Thank you guys for being here, and we will talk to you when I say very soon, I mean tomorrow, with observations and thoughts from minicamp, as well as some more intel on the Vikings GM search. Talk to you guys very, very soon.